Hi everybody. This video discusses plot in fiction. Before I begin talking about plot, I want to take a few minutes to talk about fiction itself, since this is the first week that we're discussing fiction. As we move into this, I just want us to remind ourselves what fiction is. Fiction, as I say here, is a genre of literature that describes imaginary events and people. Unlike poetry, it's arranged in paragraphs instead of verses. So when we read fiction, we're looking at something that, looks much more closer to everyday writing. And it usually tells some kind of story, has some kind of narrative, and it deals with imaginary events instead of real events. And some common forms of fiction that you're probably familiar with are genres like short stories and novels. In this class, we'll be focusing primarily on short stories. Okay, so as you probably know, plot refers to the author's arrangement of incidents in a story. Often, the plot of stories and novels are chronological. In this kind of arrangement, the author begins with the first incident, then the second incident, and so on, until they get to the very last incident. So they're narrating or they're telling the story in chronological order. However, not all works of fiction are arranged chronologically. Sometimes works of fiction begin in the middle of things. The term for this from Latin is in medias res. And then other times, the author might incorporate flashbacks or other kinds of devices which inform the reader about incidents that happened before the opening scene of a work. So oftentimes the plot of a story is chronological, but it's not always chronological. Sometimes the author arranges incidents in a different kind of order in order to achieve a certain kind of effect. Maybe a dramatic effect, maybe to make it more exciting, or maybe to have sort of a surprise ending. The most common kind of plot structure, which you may be familiar with, is Freytag's pyramid. And this is named after the German scholar who described it, whose name was Freytag. You may also have heard this called a dramatic structure, or even sometimes a sort of plot triangle. Stories that follow this convention, or this set of rules, usually begin with some kind of exposition. So this introduces the setting and the characters. Then it moves to rising action, which is a period of increasing tension or conflict. And then there's a climax, which is the moment where there's the most tension or the most conflict. And then after that, there's a decrease of tension and conflict, which is called the falling action. And finally, the denouement, which is the release of tension. And that word denouement is just a French word, which means unknotting. So you can sort of think of it as when all of the sort of tense pieces of the plot are sort of released and everything goes back to being normal. Oops. So just to give you an example of how this works, I'm going to walk you through how one way of reading this sort of plot structure in the excerpt from Tarzan of the Apes that you're reading for this week. So the Tarzan of the Apes is a very sort of traditional story. It follows this plot structure fairly consistently. And the excerpt that you read from this week is, of course, just sort of one piece of a much larger novel, but it provides a pretty good example of how this kind of plot structure works within a piece of fiction. So it begins with exposition of sort of the main characters and the setting, and this mostly happens in paragraphs 1 through 8, where the author provides background information about Turkaz, who was sort of the evil ape, who's the sort of villain in this story, and we're sort of told a little bit about him, about his personality, and the fact that he was driven out of the tribe of apes. So he's living on his own and is kind of grumpy and angry about that. And then the sort of rising action, which is this period of increasing tension and increasing conflict, happens when Turkaz finds Jane and Esmeralda. He remembers that the tribe that he had left sort of kept his women, and he decides to carry Jane off into the forest. And then also in this part of the story, Tarzan tracks and discovers Jane and Turquoise. So this is where sort of slowly events start building, and we see this sort of tension building, and there's a conflict between Tarzan and Turquoise that is building. And then also there's possibly some sort of tension possibly building between Jane and Turquoise, and then also hints of sort of some possible romantic tension building between Jane and Tarzan. And then the climax of all of these sort of events that are tied together comes at this sort of battle between Tarzan and Turquoise, where they're basically battling over Jane. And this happens in paragraphs 38 and 40. And then this climax sort of mostly gets resolved with the death of Turquoise. So there's this exciting moment where Turquoise and Tarzan are fighting, and then Tarzan kills Turquoise, and you have the beginning of sort of the release of that tension, and things begin to go back to normal. And then I would argue that the denouement happens when Jane embraces Tarzan, and then Tarzan kisses Jane. So it's this moment when sort of everything, sort of these pieces come together, and it feels like the story is over. And this is paragraphs 41 and 47. And then if this was just a short story, it would probably end there. But because this is part of a bigger work of fiction that has a lot of different climaxes and a lot of different pieces of rising action and climaxes and falling action, after this moment we have another moment of rising action where Jane is embarrassed because sort of she let her emotions show, and she turns away from Tarzan, and then Tarzan sort of like is confused, and in this moment he sort of realizes he's in love with her but doesn't really know what to do with those, so he sort of kidnaps her and takes her into the jungle. So this is the rising action for another sort of sequence of events that happens as you move your way through the novel. So hopefully this provides some example of how this sort of sequence of events and this kind of plot structure works within a narrative. So as you read the other assigned stories for this week, I want you to keep these things that I've talked about in mind. And here's some questions to sort of guide you and to keep in mind as you're reading. First of all, as you read, I want you to think about how the events of the stories are arranged. Does the story begin with the very first event and then move chronologically, or does it follow another kind of arrangement? And then related to this, do we have flashbacks or some other kind of device that sort of is non-chronological? And if so, where are these flashbacks or devices located in the story, and how do they impact the plot? And then I also want you to think about sort of how conflict works in these stories. So first of all, think about what the central conflict of the story is. Is this an external conflict, which is a conflict between a character and another person or force, like we saw in Tarzan of the Apes, where you had that conflict between Tarzan and then the ape? Or is this more of an internal conflict, which is a conflict that happens sort of within the mind of a character? And then related to that, how is the conflict developed and how is it resolved? Does it follow Freytag's pyramid? And if so, how does it do that? And if it deviates from Freytag's pyramid, how does it deviate? Oh. And then finally, I just, once again, want to give you a quick reminder about sort of the uses of language in these stories. One of the stories that assigned for this week, or was for Emily, uses a variety of terms for African Americans. The story was published in 1931. At this time, terms like the term Negro and the term colored were fairly neutral terms for African Americans. So unlike the N-word, these weren't terms that were necessarily derogatory or dehumanizing. The N-word was also used at that time, and it was meant in a derogatory and dehumanizing way. Since that time period, these terms have been replaced by terms like Black and African American. So unless you are directly quoting from a work, I'm encouraging you and asking you to use the term Black or African American if you're going to talk about Black characters. If you're directly quoting from the novel, then you can certainly use the story, you can certainly use the terms that the author is using. So another reminder about that. So I look forward to seeing what you think about these stories, especially since we're moving from poetry into fiction.